I think one of the questions kind of relates to what you quickly kind of mentioned, your text-based work. So this notion of being very much, like your practice being very much kind of connected to language. And in this sense, having so much science presence within the works. And so we were interested in also the latent discourse that it's embedded in your work. So a discourse on the language power of communication, but also the biases that are so much within the kind of language that we use. You briefly kind of mentioned that also. Also the fact that throughout your practice, you've been working a lot with the obscene and the socially unexpected themes, but also about the marginalized voice. So a voice that it's actually lacking a language. So
that's right.
And also we noticed that throughout the years, your practice has somehow evolved from perhaps like a direct representation strictly connected to, the spoken word, perhaps. So, text-based work being, vast and big, advertisement vocabulary, but also humor, the brash humor. And then from that kind of practice, then moving into something which is a bit more diffused and yet still very poignantly somehow with like a lot of like symbolisms and archetypes in the practice. So in like the question, it's very broad, but basically what brought you to be so interested in language and kind of still, how much of that is present in your current practice?
I try to get away from language and I can't. It just kind of never goes away. So even in pieces which some people would argue are illustrative, even then there's language kind of flowing in an underneath, like a hidden river somehow. I'm just going to riff a little bit on language and we can sort of take it from there. Language is the contested territory of human definition. We as humans claim we're the only species to use language, which is not true. Language defines humanity. It's this definition of humanity that I think also twines deeply with the idea of language. I spend a lot of time thinking about or exploring language and how we define ourselves with the use of it. Questions that kind of float around in my head are like, what happens when a marginalized community represents itself? And I must say that I got really attenuated to these questions, which I'm going to put forward right now, as a member of Gran Fury, because we had these weekly meetings. There were 12 of us, and we would sit around and argue these things for a few hours every week. But recurring themes of that were, what happens when a marginalized community represents itself? What happens when the excluded demand inclusion? What happens when that community says what they want to say and not what someone else wants them to say? I examined subjugation and exclusion through this medium of language. Different conversations in different contexts produce different kinds of exclusion or reveal different kinds of exclusion and subjugation. Language also forms art history, and more explicitly, the myth of the master. As Sue Savage-Rambaugh, a primatologist, says, language is the home of the mind. That said, I'm also fascinated by the slipperiness of language and how images and words can mean different things. I have an image that I always love to show when talking about language, which is a bonobo who is basically in captivity, but there's a group of bonobos living in the south of the United States in a community. I could do a whole talk on that, but I'm not going to. Anyway, it's a picture of Pan Banisha, who is playing an auto harp and looking at lexigrams. Lexigrams are the system of symbols that bonobos use to communicate with humans. And the symbols were actually designed with input from the bonobos. So anyway, if that picture appears at some time, that's what it is. You know, Arianna, I'm not sure I really covered everything you were saying about language. I didn't speak about humor. Humor, I have always found a really useful tool because it has a way of getting into the viewer's subconscious in a way, because it's really visceral reaction to humor. And then the sort of contemplation can follow afterwards. It's like it cracks open the, okay, what am I trying to say? Artworks are often mute. They're often mute, they're often closed, and they're often internal to themselves. Humor cracks that surface, and I find it as a way of really inviting people into the work. And through humor, they may find a way of contemplating the work that would have otherwise been closed to them.